Hello and welcome to the Read to Know podcast, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. On this podcast, we go through a book one chapter at a time, and each week we actually practice remembering what we've read. If you want to follow along, we're currently working our way through Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This week, we'll be discussing habit number 1, which is be proactive, and next week, we'll be looking at habit number 2, begin with the end in mind. I'm Zach Brown, and my friend Chris Yarber is joining me to help discuss and break down this book. And one more thing, if you've listened to the first couple episodes of us talking and rambling on about this book, first off, thanks for listening, appreciate it. And then also, if you're on Apple Podcasts, it would help us a ton if you left a rating and a review. It helps the show get pushed to new listeners. And if you're not on Apple Podcasts, no worries, just share this with a friend who might be interested. Anyway, with that being said, thanks again. And enjoy the conversation.
So Zach, are you ready for a haircut yet?
Chris, I am ready for a haircut. It is very long now. I've gone a very long time without a haircut. It's probably been 2 to 3 months since I've had a haircut now.
I have seen you in a hat and a beanie more than I've ever seen you in a hat and a beanie in my life for the couple of years I've known you. And for those who are watching on YouTube, of course, they can see that I've had a haircut, and it's a freeing experience. I never knew that a haircut.
You look like a brand new person.
Thank you.
You
I
really
appreciate that. My wife was ready for me to look like a brand new person.
Yeah.
It was coming over the years. It was bad.
Yep.
So anyway.
Yep, that's where I'm at right now. I'm using the coronavirus as an excuse to just wear a hat every day.
Right.
Because I don't need to, it's saving money basically now at this point, because I could go get a haircut. Now it's just like, I'm gonna ride it out until I'm like, I can't stand it anymore.
Right.
But I'm gonna get a haircut soon.
Right.
I'm basically to that point right now.
Right. Yeah. No, I can't pull off beanies and hats like you can. My head is just
Well, thank you.
big.
I appreciate that.
I just got a big head, and it just makes it look bigger. So I try to avoid them. So I just let it fall where where it falls. So
Yep.
Anyway, but we are today in habit 1.
3rd week, and we finally made it to habit 1. We're here. We made it.
Who knew it would take 3 weeks to get to the first habit, which is
Be proactive.
be proactive.
Yep.
Yes, not the first habit you would think would be there.
No.
But what would you think when you're reading this book for the first time? I don't know, but be proactive is the first habit that he mentions.
Yeah.
And he actually doesn't start off this chapter defining what he means by be proactive. We'll get there, and he gets there. But he actually first starts off with a word, self-awareness is the word that he starts off with. And it's interesting that he starts off with that word, and he does that because he's, of course, setting up to take us somewhere and to get into the definition of being proactive and what he means by that. But by being self-aware, he points that out as there's a big difference between us and animals, even the most intelligent of animals. Mm-hmm. And he says that we can be self-aware. In other words, we have the ability to process our own thoughts. Like animals, for example, something happens and they just react to it. We as humans, oftentimes something happens and we do react to it, but we have the ability to go back either afterwards or even before the situation and think to ourselves, okay, how am I reacting to this, or how can I react to this? What are my choices, and how am I going to do that? That's what he talks about when he begins by talking about being self-aware.
Right, exactly. And it's a really important concept, and it's funny how many kind of like integral ground-laying concepts he lays out in just the first 2 chapters and the beginning of this chapter, just to get started with these habits. Continuing on through this chapter, there were a lot of times that even I thought about the first 2 chapters that we already read. We joke about it took us a long time to finally get to the actual habits, but there's a reason. And as you read through these chapters, you start coming back to the ideas that he laid out in those first 2 chapters, and really understanding that, like we said, helps actually bring these to life a little bit more. But self-awareness, it's so interesting because I actually have never thought about self-awareness as a intrinsically human trait.
Yes.
In like that explicitly. You know what I mean? Obviously, I know we have self-awareness. Like we have the potential to be more self-aware. We can grow in our self-awareness, but never really, have I sat there and thought, man, dogs don't have self-awareness or cats don't have self-awareness or, it's just not something that we sit and kind of play on self-awareness. We don't just sit and think about that, but
No.
It's definitely an important part to self-development. You have to be self-aware to some degree in order to understand where you need to grow and how to get there. You know, it's definitely, and that's why he lays it out here at the beginning.
Yes. And I hope for those listening and maybe for those reading as well, that you enjoyed the overview chapter, which was the last chapter, the second episode, because that was probably the shortest chapter of this book, I have to guess, because this is one dense and thick chapter. We're going to do our best. For those listening and not watching, for those watching, you can see that we don't have the book in front of us. And that's what we do in the second half is pull out the book and move through some things. But even before we started recording, we said, this is a dense chapter. We're going to try to retain and remember and teach each other as much as we can. But at the same time, I know that we're going to have to pull out this book for the second half, this chapter, and go through a lot of different material because it is a dense and a thick chapter because there's several different sets of three.
Yeah.
And as we're trying to read to remember, to retain, and not just read and move on, of course, I look back at those three different sets of three or even more that are in this chapter, and I'm trying to remember and study them so that I can rehearse them, as we talk about them. Yeah. And I think the first one that we get to after he talks about the self-awareness is we get to three different social maps. Yeah. And do you remember all three of the social maps? The social maps
where, man, once I hear them, I'm going to know exactly.
Right.
It's, oh God.
The first one is because all these different social maps, what he's trying to do is he's trying to explain the way that we are.
Yes.
And I have a confession. I asked you what the three social maps were to give me a little bit of time to think about them.
Yeah.
And now I think I've thought of them, if I'm correct. The first one is genetic.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And then the second one is psychic. And then the third is environmental.
Yes.
So do you remember, now that we've named those three, because you've given me a little time to remember them, do you remember how those three are broken out?
Yes, it's those names that kick into gear. And I wrote down, I think I even marked why, the why behind the names, and obviously the genetic is the DNA related, mapping. It's kind of they're kind of like excuses that we can give ourselves for why our life is the way that it is, why we have this problem, why we have this roadblock, that all those things. The first one being genetic, which is basically, you got it from your DNA. It's in your DNA. Your grandparents had it. Their grandparents had it. Now you have it. You always,
why are you so angry all the time? It's because your grandfather
it runs in the family.
Was angry. Yeah.
Yep. All that thing. All that whole idea.
Yeah. By nature explanation of why we are the way we are.
Which obviously there is a certain amount of DNA and genetics that play into everything, but it's not the reason, it's not, as he goes into, there's more to it than that. And you can choose how to respond to those different things as we get into. But then the second one, what was the name of it again? It was psychic.
Psychic.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is the, your upbringing, your environment in your childhood and upbringing. So then that's the influence your parents had on you. It's the influence that, the people who raised you.
Yes.
Gave you, if you grew up in a great home or if you grew up in a terrible home or, whatever your home life was like, that sort of thing. Then the third one was environmental, which is everything else, which is your boss, your girlfriend, your, your neighbor, your colleague.
Yeah. Your hormonal teenager.
Yeah.
Living in your house. All of that appeals to how we react the way that we react. And he sets that up to give us some insights into why we may react the way that we do. But then that's when he gets into the definition and the explanation of what he means by proactive, this first habit. And a lot of people think that proactive just means to take initiative on something, but that's not necessarily how he defines being proactive.
Yep.
And really what he says, it's a little bit painful when you first read it. So you got to have some tough skin, when you go through this first habit and he talks about this in the chapter, doing a lot of self-evaluation.
Yep.
And I believe he talks about this at the beginning, kind of setting yourself outside of yourself and looking down at yourself and your life. And as he gets into this first habit,
and I think that's the whole that's kind of a common theme throughout this first chapter, and I think it'll probably be throughout the rest of it too. Is that all these things that he's talking about? They're kind of a hard pills to swallow. A lot of tough stuff, because as he says later on, it's you basically have to just become self-responsible, and you have to accept that you are in charge of your own life.
Right.
And, it's the same with and probably any of these habits and integrating them. Mm-hmm. But it's a lot of things that were like, I don't know if I want to take responsibility for that almost. You know what I mean? And that's what he's talking about. It's the same thing with the animals, talking about the animals being reactive, that we can tend to be almost animalistic in nature and just react to whatever the world throws at us. And proactive is basically the opposite of that, obviously, being proactive. But it's more than just, like you said, being gung-ho about things and just taking charge and being, taking initiative.
Right.
But it's basically, I kind of thought of it as I was reading the chapter. It's like, he mentioned positive mental attitude in the very first chapter. Mm-hmm. It's like positive mental attitude. It's similar because that's part of the equation of this habit. But it's like positive mental attitude on steroids.
Yes.
It's taking it to the next level.
Yes. Yeah. So, as we stated, a lot of people think of proactive, they think of taking initiative, which is not the whole definition for him. Really, when he says be proactive, and it's funny that this habit is the first one, and he plans that strategically because it's this habit that every other habit is built upon.
Right.
If you don't get this, the others are going to be very hard to get a hold of, because we need to recognize that in order to be proactive, what he means by that is that we are responsible for the decisions that we make. Apart from our circumstances, we make decisions, and no matter what our circumstances are, we, and only us ourselves, have the ability to be proactive. In other words, to make decisions that we're going to make, not based on our circumstances, but based on our outlook and our response. And then throughout the rest of the chapter, he breaks apart those who are proactive and what their life looks like, and those who are reactive and what their life look like. Mm-hmm. Because other than just self-awareness, he also talks about another three things. He also says, apart from self-awareness, we also have imagination.
Right.
We also have
knowledge was another one.
Knowledge was another one. Mm-hmm. And then a third one was consequence. Was it consequence?
Conscience.
Conscience, yes. Knowing what was right, knowing distinctly what is right and wrong. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about the difference between proactive and reactive people, that reactive people, go based solidly off of their feelings, that you're just reacting. It's in the name. You're just reacting. And those who are proactive recognize the difficulty of the situation, but their response looks a lot different. Mm-hmm. It's not based upon their circumstances, based on their decision, which is where he gets into, and if you want to talk about him, you can, the Viktor Frankl. Is that how you meant? Is that how you?
Viktor Frankl.
Frankl. Frank L. It's Frank L.
Yeah. I was listening to the audiobook as I was reading.
Yes.
And at least by Stephen Covey, who was actually reading the audiobook, he said Viktor Frankl. That's how he said it.
Frank, and it's spelled Frankl.
Right.
So anyway, yes. Yeah. So you want to tell his story?
Yeah. And Viktor Frankl, and it kind of, he doesn't tell these stories at the exact same time, but I think this story of Viktor Frankl and the story of Joseph, which he talks about a little bit later on in the chapter, they kind of go hand in hand.
Yes. In Joseph in the Bible, not Joseph just some random Joseph.
Yes.
Yeah.
Joseph from the Old Testament.
Yes, Joseph from the Old Testament.
And their stories kind of are very similar, and they kind of go hand in hand for this example. But obviously, these two people had you'd call it a rough life, like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There were things, and I was talking
to put it mildly,
yeah,
because poor Frankl,
right,
was in Germany during
Yeah.
Nazi Germany, was in an internment camp. So
Yep.
yeah.
And was in a Nazi camp, and his whole family killed.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Other than
And-
his sister.
Yeah, other than his
How
sister.
do I remember that detail? I have no idea. But other than his sister, it's the stories that grab
Right,
you, and that's why
right.
he writes these stories in. But
Yeah, to drive these points home. Yeah. And not knowing if he'd ever make it out of there alive or what would happen. He could die that day or the next day, or and he was in there for I don't know how long, but he was in there for a long time, and obviously finally made it out. And then of course the story of Joseph, being sold into slavery,
Right.
And then
By his
his
brothers.
brothers, yeah, and then working for Potiphar, and then being falsely accused,
Yeah.
and being thrown into prison for 13 years, but then eventually rising to the ranks of second in command
Yeah.
in Egypt.
Talk about a psychic
Yeah,
social
yeah.
map when your family's the one that throws you into slavery.
Seriously. And I mean, these people definitely had to, as he talks about, they chose to respond in a positive way.
Yes.
They didn't choose to look at their environment and look at the situation they're in and say, oh, poor me.
Right.
Oh my gosh, like I have it so rough. And I mentioned this to you before the podcast, that I don't know, there's probably never going to be anything in my lifetime that I experienced that is anywhere as terrible as what these two people went through.
Right.
And, you know what I mean? And maybe some people they may experience things that are that bad, but I probably won't. You know what I mean? And man, if they can choose to look at their situation and think positively about it, and not just pretend that there's nothing bad. And Stephen Covey makes a point of that. He's like, being proactive is not being blind to the negatives, right? You know what I mean? You got to look at the situation for what it is, and that's the difference he makes between positive mental attitude and being proactive. Is that positive mental attitude is just like, hey, let's just be positive,
No matter what the situation is, let's be positive.
But proactive is hey, let's look at the facts. Let's get real for a second. But then let's move beyond that, and let's see how we can choose to respond in a positive way, even though the situation is overtly negative.
Yes.
And we can actually be better for it if we do that.
Yes.
And not dwell on the things that are, as we'll get to, outside of our control.
Yeah.
And focus on the things that are inside our control that we can handle. And the first thing that is inside our control is our mental state and our attitude.
Yes. What was so grabbing about that story about Frankel, and the same is true for Joseph, in a lesser sense, even us, because again, as you mentioned, we are not going through anything near as rough, most of us, as these two men did. One thing that grabbed me about Frankel's story was Covey wrote how he was alone and naked in one of those rooms that they had a bunch of people in. And he began to think to himself, okay, they can take away a lot of things. They can take away my clothes. They can by taking away the clothes, they take away things like your dignity, and just, it's super embarrassing, and just all of these emotions that we could not even comprehend. There's a lot that they can take away.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they cannot take away was his identity, was his mental state of mind and attitude. And as he began to make that change, as he began to become proactive with his decisions and with his mental state and attitude, other people there in the camp, and even some of the guards, noticed, which is how powerful and how effective this proactive habit is, which reminded me of another story that he writes in this chapter about a boss at a company. Yeah. And I don't know if he didn't give the company's name.
But he was doing some consultation.
Consultation.
Yeah, he was consulting with this company and with this boss of this company.
And this boss, he's just one of those bosses that everyone wants to be away from, and when they are away from him, they complain about him all the time, is what they were doing. And he mentions in this chapter that a proactive person, instead of complaining about their boss, because there was one executive in that group that saw the weaknesses that his boss had. We all have weaknesses. We're not perfect. And so he sees those weaknesses. Instead of complaining and mistreating him behind his back, what he decided to do was to be proactive and to make the decision, I'm going to substitute for his weaknesses my strengths. Right. And what that enabled him to do was to become more effective and become more of an influencer, which we can talk about the circle of influence after this, because that's a big part of this chapter. But he he becomes a big influencer. And so at the next meeting, as he's substituting his strengths for his boss's weaknesses, of course, the boss notices how effective he's now being at his job. And because he is being proactive, and at the next meeting, the boss is demanding this and demanding that from other people, as he always did. But then he looks at that guy and he says, "What's your opinion on this?"
Right,
Which he never asked anyone that.
Yep.
But he was demanding a lot from other people, and then asked this guy, "What's your opinion?" All because he was being proactive.
Yep.
So it just shows the power of this.
And he was going above and beyond with those situations. He was thinking about his boss's needs. He was putting his boss's needs, thoughts ahead of his own, and be like, "What does he need here? What would he want from me?
Yes.
And what would be going above and beyond to get that to him?"
Yes.
And the crazy thing about kind of contrasting these two stories, like Viktor Frankl and Joseph versus this version, this kind of
modern
story,
day version
modern day version, right?
Right.
The modern day version is a little bit closer to something that we will probably experience.
Yes.
But still, like, how difficult is that? Like, what I mean? It's still hard. It's still, it's not easy. It's easier said than done.
Right.
And to actually, again, he said proactive. It's being intentional, and you have to actually work towards it. It's not something that is easy to do. But as he says, also, we're intrinsically like. We're us as people, we are people who gravitate towards being proactive. It's like in our nature,
right?
But it's not easy.
No. And he mentions in this chapter that it is being proactive that makes and breaks habits.
Yeah,
because the difficult thing about being proactive is this is a daily challenge. I would say an hourly challenge as well, because we're always responding to different situations we're placed in. And so this is something that's going to make and break the rest of the habits, and why he starts off with this one, because he says this is going to build upon every other one's going to be built on this one.
Exactly. And, I'd also mentioned this to you earlier, but like how powerful is just this one habit that, like, even if we got nothing else out of this book, if we were able to integrate this habit consistently, still a life changer, because it's so much more than, it's again, like going back to the first couple chapters, it's all about paradigm shifts, shifting your thought mentality from this way to that way. And really the next section, jumping into the next section of this chapter, is he talks about the language aspect of being proactive, which is another huge part, right? And it's similar, obviously the example was in that business story, right? Where this guy's coworkers, every time they got out of a meeting with the boss, they talked about, how terrible he is. Man, goodness gracious, will he ever get off our backs? That kind of thing. And how often, and of course, going through this and talking about, we use language like that all the time. And him, Stephen Covey, mentioning this, of course, I could think about so many things that I've said that I'm like, yep, I did that. Yep. I said that, and and those are just having a negative effect on our thinking and on our proactivity, because it's basically pushing the blame. And that's basically what all this language stuff comes down to, is that it pushes the blame from me to someone else or some other thing, or that it's so you don't have to take responsibility for it.
Yes. And in this chapter, he gives, in that language section, he gives different two different lists. One is a list of different sayings you may hear from reactive people. The other is similar sayings but different, because it has a proactive spin on it. The reactive language has a lot of I in it, of course, because it's self-concentrated.
Right.
It's not, as he mentioned in the very first chapter, you're not thinking outward first, you're thinking inward first, and that's what reactive people, that's what we all do. But in reactive situations, that language is very I heavy. And the reason why this, not only the mental and the attitude proactiveness, but also our language being proactive as well, the reason why that's so important is because he breaks down 3 different areas of control. And so just like in this business scenario, this business story, there are really 3 different levels of control in that business scenario. The first one is direct control.
Right.
That manager or executive who decided that. I'm going to play to my boss's, I'm going to pair his weaknesses with my strengths to help him out and meet his needs, as we discussed. That's indirect control. That's something he can control.
And how he responds to the things that his boss tells him that he might not agree with or he might not like.
Right.
That's what's in his control, how he responds to the situation.
And then there's indirect control, which is other people's reactions.
Yep.
Now, of course, you can't control other people's reactions, but we do have relationships with those people and encounters and reactions with those. And so that's indirect control. And then there are also things that we have absolutely no control over whatsoever. And we never will, whether it's, our health is one example he gives. Your children is another example he gives, and a couple others. But yeah, control, direct control, indirect, and then
out of our control. Yeah. No control. Yeah, exactly. And, that's important to think about. And that's what he challenges us with in this chapter is, hey, let's just think about things that are inside of our control.
Right.
Let's not worry. And he talks about it as in circle of influence and I'm blanking on the other one. What's the other one? Circle of influence, and then the circle of concern.
Circle of concern. Yeah, I was gonna say in the graph, which we can pop up on those watching YouTube. But there's in my infographic book, which I'm still very much enjoying. There's the circle of influence, which is in a broader white purplish circle, and then the smaller is that second circle. Yeah.
Yeah. Circle of concern. Concern. Yeah, and so he's saying let's focus on what's in our circle of influence, what we can actually influence and control ourselves. And again, that's our emotional. That's our response to external things that happen in our lives. That's how we respond to things. That's how we choose to act. We choose to do this. We choose to do that. That's in our level of our circle of influence. And then our circle of concern are those things that may be concerning to us. We may care about them, but we can't actually influence that in a positive way. There's nothing we can do to influence that,
Right.
And so that's why he calls it the circle of concern. And let's not spend negative energy on things that we can't even control. That's basically what he's saying.
Right.
And he says it in better words than I can, but that's basically what he's saying.
Yeah. And spend our energy on, instead of spending our energy on those things we cannot control, spend our energy on our reaction to those things, our thoughts, our attitude, our language. And tell me if you have something else. I don't mean to skip ahead just from here straight to the end, but I love how this chapter ends with a 30-day proactive challenge.
Yeah.
It's the last bit that he gives, and tell me if you want to go back, we can. But I love how he ends with that 30-day challenge and breaks apart, and we'll talk about this specifically when we open the book, but gives direct quotations to try this and try this about being proactive and not reactive. I love how he ends with that challenge.
Yeah. Which is definitely a challenge.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah. Yeah. It's a small step towards a very big goal.
Yeah.
But this is going to, I don't want to say, of course, that this more than any other habit, because they all work cohesively, but this can lead to great effectiveness.
Exactly.
As a leader, as a husband, as a wife, whatever your situation may be, as a student.
Yep.
Again, that's why this book is so incredible. It applies to all those areas.
Yep, exactly. And to a couple more things. Of course, he has a couple great quotes, throughout this whole thing, and we'll have to pull those up because some of the stuff he just says better than we can.
Yes.
But that's part of practicing to remember and continue discussing this without the book in front of us. But yeah, I mean, it basically it comes down to, at least for me when I'm reading this and stuff, it just comes down to what is in my control and what I can have direct control over. It's yourself.
Yes.
You know what I mean? As much as that, and again, it's a hard pill to swallow because we want to fix everyone else, me included. I want to fix everyone else.
Yes.
Everyone else has problems, whatever.
Right.
But really, that's not what we can control.
No.
We can't, and we're wasting time thinking about.
We are.
Dwelling on that, saying, talking negative about someone else. And he says it. I underlined it because I wanted to bring it up when we opened the book up. He talks about, talking about, a husband and wife, and say like a husband is nagging on his wife about all the terrible things she does or whatever. And it's not just that, but it's even deeper. It goes even deeper than just it goes even deeper than just him nagging on his wife. You know what I mean? It's basically, he equated it to speaking that over her, in a sense. You know, our words are important, and what we say influences other people, whether we like it or not, and it's influencing her negatively in that. It's not actually that him nagging her is not actually going to get her to stop doing those things, but it's actually just going to embed those things deeper into her own psyche.
Yes.
Is basically what he's saying. And I don't think we think about that. I don't typically think about that kind of stuff, but that's basically what it's doing. And that's another thing. That's another level of importance to why we need to be careful in the language that we speak and how we talk about things.
Yeah. This book very much reminds me of such a famous line, been talked about so much, but Michael Jackson's "Man in the Mirror." If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself. That's where it starts. Stephen, he's like, if you want to make the world a better place, be proactive. That's pretty much what he's saying, and what he
take
what
a
he
look
means
at yourself
by,
and make a change
by this. Yeah.
That's hilarious. That's exactly what he's saying.
Right, and I that's why I love that he. Yes, we should only worry about the things that we are in direct control of, but there are also people around us that we are indirectly control of. It is indirect, but it's still direct, that by us changing our behavior, attitude, and language, we will see, just like with Frank Kell and others, and Joseph's story as well in the Old Testament, that other people around them were changed because of their proactiveness. Other people, whether they recognized it or not, started to become proactive.
Right. And he says this earlier on in the chapter, but the good news is that also we're flexible. We can change. We can basically transform ourselves into someone else. You know what I mean? Everything that we've been through in life, everything that we've done, all that stuff is not who we are.
No.
He even goes as far as to say, and in what he said in the book, are even our thoughts, right? Our thoughts are not intrinsically who we are.
No.
And
our feelings are not intrinsically
our
who
feelings,
we are.
Our thoughts are not who we are. It's the character within us, and we can work on that every day, and we can work to change that. We can work to transform ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's what he's talking about. That encompasses the whole being proactive habit.
Yes. He takes a shot at Hollywood as well towards the end. Because, and by Hollywood, popular culture, these movies, songs and stuff like that, he takes a shot at them by saying, their movies and entertainment and stuff perceive as if feelings and thoughts and stuff is not your fault.
Right.
But really all of those things are in our direct control, which even bringing that to light, I hope that for many of us who are listening and reading, we can be like that woman that when he was speaking at a conference. You remember this chapter? He talks about that woman who stands up because she's so excited, and then she kind of sits down after she notices what she just did, that she stood up and started talking all excited. But then she also started talking to people around her. And then afterwards, Stephen went up to her and was talking with her about, pretty much why'd you do that? That was interesting. And she was just so ecstatic to hear this news and to come to this realization that my workplace is bad was pretty much her story, but how I react to it is all on me.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's all on me.
And again, that's an easy thing to say. It's a hard thing to actually do.
Yeah.
But I think when we come to that realization and we work towards that, that's when it starts to change.
Yes.
And it won't all happen, we can't just go from 0 to, all right, I'm proactive 100%. Like I'm there, you know? And that's why the last habit is, again, sharpening the saw,
right? Because
you're constantly working on all of these, but starting that process and getting there is half the battle.
Yes,
it's to coming to that paradigm shift of a realization. You're already over the first hurdle.
Right. I like to think of habits in this way, that we don't achieve victory, quote unquote, with our habits. when they actually become habits, because they don't become habits until we have these smaller victories that each time, and that's what we should celebrate as we work to become more effective people. We should celebrate and recognize our victories every single day, that even if in one day, in dealing with your boss or dealing with a teenager or dealing with a parent or something like that that's challenging, if we can recognize each time we are proactive and celebrate that, I think that will help to inform and install that habit within us even better. It's something we definitely have to celebrate as we do it each and every day.
And he talks about that in the very end of towards the very end of the chapter. He talks about the first step is literally making small commitments for yourself.
That's right.
And following through with those commitments.
Yes. And he talks about honor at the end as well, which is not a word that we throw out a lot, but by becoming more proactive, honor becomes a part of that by keeping these small promises, by following through with things maybe we didn't follow through with before. Honor is one of those things that we achieve. So I had to slow down my talking. You got me excited. I was talking real fast. So anyway.
You were doing it. Yeah, you were adding. You were trying to add external thought to what he had to say, and and he already he said it.
He said it.
I
just didn't remember it. And you clicked it for me. Yeah. That was my Virginia talking really fast. Which you're from Ohio, so you understand. You can listen to people talk fast anyway.
Yeah. And that's funny. That's of course, like with all these that we've done so far, as we continue to talk, more and more of the chapter comes back to our minds, and it definitely helps like that we're talking together, because I would not have made it as far through this chapter on my own.
No,
but I think we covered it pretty well.
I think we did.
I think that's probably a good stopping point right there. If you want to open up the book, we can get started with that.
Let's open up the book.
All right, sounds good. All right, so we're back here, and we have the physical books. When I say physical books, I have my physical book. Chris, again, rocking the Kindle version.
Always with the Kindle version.
I mean, I like that. We gotta have diversity here.
Yes.
You know what I mean? We gotta keep it fresh.
You've listened to the Audible version.
Yes, I listen to the audiobook as I read through the physical book.
Yeah.
I like that. It kind of helps me. It helps me stay focused and on track.
Yes.
And I get through it, pretty quickly. If I have it on like 1.5 speed, maybe today I actually had it on like 1.8 speed, so close to 2x. Usually 2 times speed is a little too fast.
Yeah, it is. Especially for this dense of a book.
Yeah, for this dense of a book.
For anyone, no matter what your age is, venturing into this, it's a complex. There's some complex paradigms and shifts in here.
Yep.
That he navigates through. And I actually, just a little reading tip, listening to the audiobook and following along with your eyes is great.
Yeah.
That's 2 ways that you're taking it in. I like to read out loud. When I'm really trying to understand something, I like to read out loud. And then that way you're looking at it, you're reading it, and you're also kind of hearing yourself, of course.
Right.
And it allows my mind to not get as off track as I would if I'm just looking at it like this, because I could read a whole paragraph and I'm thinking of Lucky Charms. Hold on, let me go back to that, and because I'm hungry, something like that.
Yep,
your mind gets off track. Yep. Yeah, we've all done that. So
yeah, exactly. That's actually a good tip. Read out loud.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I like that. And so anyway, starting this chapter off, I actually want to read the quote up here, because like the quote of this chapter is from Henry David Thoreau. And he says, "I know no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to elevate his life by conscious endeavor." Mm-hmm. And that's really the theme of this chapter. But that's honestly, it's like the theme of this book. You know what I mean? Is basically just elevating your life by an intentional, conscious endeavor. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what this book and chapter is about. But jumping into the fourth paragraph here, he says, "We are not our feelings. We are not our moods. We are not even our thoughts." Right. And it's basically coming to seeing yourself in a new identity is like the first step of being proactive. Right. Mm-hmm. It's seeing yourself from a new identity. It's basically an identity paradigm shift is kind of what I even, came to my mind. Mm-hmm. It's just an identity paradigm shift. And so it's basically, it's easy to find our value or find our own self-worth in external things, in other people's opinions, in our grades and this, that, or the other thing, And that's the first step of being proactive is to pivot where you find your personal value, right? And obviously he doesn't go too deep into it here, but it's really what Jesus says about you. That's where you find your value. But that's the key. That's basically the first point of being proactive here,
right? And that's how he defines self-awareness, is that it enables us to stand apart and examine even the way we see ourselves. Of course, and people would say, well, duh, that's what self-awareness is. But as you mentioned, it really is a self-paradigm, which out of the paradigms that he talked about in the first chapter, he jumping to this one, he says this is the most fundamental paradigm for effectiveness.
Exactly.
It starts with a self-paradigm with ourselves.
Right. And he lists out things that people may say that, if you based your identity on social situations, like he calls it the social paradigm, and which is from other people's opinions, perspectives, and thoughts about us, these could, he talks, if someone said, you're never on time, why can't you keep things in order? You eat like a horse, I can't believe you won, or this is so simple, why can't you understand? If that's where your identity lies, then those will hit you pretty hard.
Yes, they will.
And if that's not, if you're proactive, those, it might still sting a little bit, but it's not gonna stop you, and it's not gonna rock your world like it would if you placed your identity in people's opinions or what people say about you.
Yes, yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. Not that it's not going to hurt. This is not at all. Being proactive is not at all about ignoring and hiding the pain.
Right.
Really what it's doing is it's recognizing and saying to yourself, okay, that was painful, but I cannot control the words that came out of the mouth.
Right.
What made me laugh so hard about that you just read there was my wife has told me before, you eat like a horse. I love to eat. She has literally said to me before, you eat like a horse, has said that to me. And, you just recognize that did sting a little bit. But at the same time, I see myself in this self-paradigm. I recognize, I have self-awareness to know that, yes, I know the consequences, because he talks about consequences, as we'll get to. Something I don't think we mentioned when we were in the first half of the podcast. But so there are consequences to eating, but at the same time, I recognize that I'm on a Lucky Charm bit for some reason. Now I want to have a bowl of cereal.
Love Lucky Charms.
I love Lucky Charms. Anyway, so that's just the self-awareness, not being stuck in that pain, realizing that pain is there, but being able to have the self-awareness to react and be proactive in our reaction. So
Right. And this is the key distinction that he makes with, he says statements like that. They are often more projections than reflections, projecting the concerns and character weaknesses of people giving the input rather than accurately reflecting what we are. And so it's just an easy thing to basically remember and say, people may say things about you or to you, or, and it's not what you are. You know what I mean? That's not who you are. You know what I mean? And like you said, you can transform yourself into someone different and choose, and it's, as he talks about, it's a choice. All of this is how you choose to respond, what you choose to do, what actions you choose to take, which will then get you the outcome or consequence or end result.
Yes,
based on it's all about how you choose.
Yes, one of the most I think cohesive sections of this chapter was this between stimulus and response section. Exactly. And this is when we get into Frankel's story. He has this great quote, which on the Kindle version, of course, the pages do not align at all. And yours, this may be on page 77, but on mine it says page 101. It makes it look like a huge book because it's out of 537 pages, so it makes us look even smarter than what we actually are. But he mentions in this between stimulus and response, he says this quote that in the midst of the most degrading circumstances imaginable, talking about Frankel.
Yeah.
He used the human endowment of self-awareness to discover a fundamental principle about the nature of man, and this is where it becomes so good, that between stimulus and response, man has the freedom to choose. And that's the realization we have to come to in order to be proactive, that we have a choice between stimulus and response. We have a freedom to choose between those two. So very, very, that struck me very much, like that woman we talked about earlier when I read that.
Huge. Yeah. Other quotes in talking about this same thing here. He could decide within himself how he was going to let this affect him.
Yes.
He just chose. That's how I'm going to let this affect me this way.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And it's as simple as that. Again, not easy, but it's as simple as that.
Right.
You know, and that's what he says. Within the freedom to choose are those endowments and that's what makes us uniquely human. That's what separates us from every other, what other animals and everything else, is that we have self-awareness. And you talked about the things that make up the human element.
Yes.
Is self-awareness, imagination, conscience, and independent will.
Yeah. That's what makes us uniquely human. That's why he mentions those. And then even goes on to say that even the most intelligent animals have none of these endowments.
Exactly. Yeah. And because of these, he goes on, we can write new programs for ourselves totally apart from our instincts and training. So again, he's literally saying no matter what you've done, no matter what you've trained yourself to do, no matter what habits maybe negative habits that you've created, we can transform ourselves into something different.
Right.
We can break down the old, whatever it is, and turn it into something new.
Right.
But it's a conscious, it's a intentional choice, and intentional action is required to do it.
Right. I'm telling you, in this chapter, as we said before we started recording, you could underline just about every single sentence in this chapter, because just about every single one of it is good.
Right.
I didn't know if you had any more quotes in that section, or if we could get to the proactivity defined.
Yeah, we can go ahead and move on.
So I just wanted to read the definition. He writes that
proactivity.
Yes, of proactivity.
Yeah.
That it means more than merely taking initiative. It means that as human beings, we are responsible for our own lives, that our behavior is a function of our decisions, not our conditions.
Yep.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, a function of our decisions, not our conditions, our behavior.
Yep. And again, all of this, like as we said before, all of this is redirecting to, to blaming or putting excuses to other people, and turning it inward and saying it's all on me. It's all on me. And that's what this whole thing, and that's what he's talking about here.
And he even breaks down that word responsibility, response-ability, the ability to choose your response.
The response ability.
Yes.
And highly proactive people recognize that responsibility. Highly proactive people say, all right, this might be my situation, but this is not what I'm not going to let it stay this way, and I'm going to control what I can control, and I'm going to do the things that I need to do to make this better for me.
Right.
And even if that is just changing the way I respond, to my boss, the way or how I won't let negative things affect my emotions that way. You know, I'll choose to not get ridiculously angry at this or that.
And let's weigh the balances here. Let's think about it this way. Whether you're focusing on being proactive at your job, or you're focusing on being proactive in your marriage or with a parent relationship, if you're still living at home, think about it this way. What we've done so far at our place of work, at our home, in our marriage, really hasn't worked all that well. We really haven't been all that effective, which is why I'm so glad that he's bringing this to light, because this is something new for us to try. It may be very, very difficult. The realization may be easy to come to when we read and break apart these different definitions that he gives and talk about self-awareness. But I mean, really, when I started reading this, I thought to myself, well, what other action do we have? Because what we've been doing has not made us effective. It has not been working, and so that's how we can step back and look at this.
And again, recalling back to the first chapter, it's all inside out. It begins from the inside,
right?
And that's how you can actually make positive, huge, change, incrementally in your life.
Yes.
And he continues here. There's another quote that I like: because we are by nature proactive, If our lives are a function of conditioning and conditions, it is because we have, by conscious decision or by default, chosen to empower those things to control us.
Yes.
Which basically, is so, again, almost counterintuitive to the way I think that we think. But he's saying, we're actually made to be proactive.
Right.
Right? We are created to respond this way, to not just take initiative, but to directly control what is in our realm of influence and tackle that. We're not made to be concerned with what we can't control.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
That's what he's saying. And the only reason that we are in that position, if we're not proactive, if we're just reactive, it's because we've just let ourselves slip into reactivity.
Yes.
And it's not our intuitive nature. That's not how we were created to live,
Yes.
And so that's, I think that's a positive, you know what I mean? Because it sounds like, man, gosh, this just sounds like a lot of work. You know what I mean?
Right.
But
right.
it's a lot of, it is work, but it's work that is we're made to do it.
Yes. In the second chapter, he talks about, for these habits, the importance of establishing habits. There's knowledge, the know-how, the skill, and then the desire. And the desire for me, when it came to this being proactive, one of the quotes that really struck me and began this desire just inside of me personally was when he wrote, "But until a person can say deeply and honestly, I am what I am today because of the choices I made yesterday, that person cannot say, I choose otherwise."
Yeah.
And so I think for this, after we read this chapter, we discuss it maybe with a friend or have time rehearsing it, we have the knowledge.
Yeah.
And there may be a certain quote or a certain time or a certain story in this chapter that then lights the fire of desire. The skill, I think, is going to take that repetitiveness of, okay, this is how I'm going to be proactive and not reactive. This is how I'm going to react. This is how I'm going to react to this situation and this situation. I'm going to make this choice. That's where the skill comes in.
Right.
And I know it's the desire that carries those habits long term. And I could be wrong in this, but I sense that the skills may take a little bit longer than the knowledge and the desire. Now, keeping the desire is very, very difficult. But I believe for this first habit, being proactive, I think the skill is going to take a while to develop.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree too with this first habit. I think skill is probably the one that all of us is probably what we need to build the most.
Yeah.
In building this habit is the skill. It's just the practice, getting into the practice of being proactive constantly. And it's basically just like a lot of mental checks throughout the day. Hey, am I being proactive? That kind of thing. And it definitely takes all three of those.
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah.
And he also says down here, proactive people are still influenced by external stimuli. We talked about this earlier, right? About, things people say or, how people treat you. But whether physical, social, or psychological, but their response to the stimuli is actually value-based by choice or response. It's value-based. That's where they come from in their response. And I think that's important, an important distinction to be made. Proactive. You're saying this is how I choose to respond, no matter how I feel. And then that's a hard thing too. You know what I mean? It's all, like I said, I feel like I've said this a lot. It's not easy, but saying this is how I'm going to choose to respond in these situations. You know what I mean? When I get frustrated, I'm going to choose to respond this way.
Yeah.
Because this aligns with my values.
Yes.
And it takes a lot of intentional thought behind that, I think, to maybe even sit down and be like, how do I want to respond when I'm frustrated? You know what I mean? Like, and think about what would be the best way to respond based on your values. And then the next time you're frustrated, you can think back to that. It's probably something I need to do. I need to sit down. When I'm frustrated, how should I respond? And then next time I'm frustrated,
that's
I'll be like,
practicing.
this is what I said that I would choose. So I'm going to choose this.
Well, that's practicing self-awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And And I've definitely had moments like that with like even I think the language thing, especially we'll get to those kind of quotes in a second, but that language thing really struck me because I've definitely, and I don't know exactly for what reason, but I've definitely had more thoughts about the language that I use recently over the past months or even the last year or so. And I don't catch myself every time, but there are times where I catch myself and I'm like, I'm saying that. I should change the way I word that. You know what I mean? And I'll just read off this list here. So here's the list of reactive language versus proactive language. So a reactive saying would be, there's nothing that I can do. A proactive response would be, let's look at our alternatives. A reactive would be, that's just the way I am. Proactive would be, I can choose a different approach, and so on and so forth. And, how many times, I've caught myself literally, I didn't have a word for it, but it was reactive language, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I've been like, I should choose to pick my words more carefully and reframe the situation to be in a more positive light.
Yes. I did. While you were reading off that list,
Yeah.
and now that we're looking at it, I noticed earlier in the podcast in the first half, forgive me, I got the two switched up when I said that the I language is in the reactive. I meant proactive, but I just realized to myself, I said reactive, but proactive, that I language meaning proactive is important because, again, the choice is ours.
Exactly.
The choice is ours. That's where the self-awareness comes in. The choice is ours.
Yep.
So that's what I meant for those who are listening and going, looking at the book while we're rehearsing the podcast going, wow, he got that absolutely wrong. Yes, I did.
That's funny. I didn't even catch that when you said that. And I was right on track with you.
Yeah, I'm just making that proactive decision to say that and to accept it and to move on.
Yep.
So, yeah, what other any other quotes that you wanted to mention before we get maybe to the taking the initiative section?
Yeah. And okay, so this is the taking the initiative, and this follows along with what we were just talking about. Our basic nature is to act and not be acted upon. Yeah. That's what he's saying here. And again, it's like this is in our nature. This is not something that is foreign to us that we have to kind of work. It's an uphill battle, but it's not against us. We're made for this,
Right.
And he was talking about, again, kind of another little story here. He's talking with young people who are talking about how they want to get jobs that they want, right?
Yes.
And he says, well, why don't you go find a problem that company is facing, come up with a solution for it, and then make a whole presentation and everything and come to that company or business and be like, here's this issue that I know you guys are facing. Here's how I can help you solve it.
Right.
And this is what we can do about it.
And they call that solution selling, what they call that. I wouldn't have been able to remember it if I wasn't looking at the book, but solution selling, what you're selling them on is a solution, and that solution is yourself.
Yeah.
Is really what it is. Yes, you've come up with a solution, an external solution that's going to help beyond yourself, and if they were to practice, could be a solution long after you leave there. But really what you're selling them on during that job interview is yourself.
Yep. And that's what he's talking about. You're providing value for that company, and that company hires you because, hey, you actually are valuable to us, and we need you on the team because you will help us solve these problems.
Yes.
And he says that their response, these people's response to when he tells them this, is the response is usually agreement. Most people can see how powerfully such an approach would affect their opportunities for employment or advancement, but many of them fail to take the necessary steps, the initiative to make it happen. And he goes down, if I go down a couple more paragraphs, he says, many people wait for something to happen or someone to take care of them.
Right.
They wait for someone to take care of them or to do the job for them. But people who end up with the good jobs are the proactive ones who are solutions to problems, not problems themselves. And they seize the initiative to do whatever is necessary to get the job done.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
people have enough problems,
right?
And when they're looking for a candidate for a job,
they don't need another one.
They do not need another one.
They're not looking for another one.
And oftentimes, think about it this way: oftentimes, if there is a position open, it's because potentially, unless it's just created,
right?
Potentially, there was a problem, and that problem has left.
Was the last
either
problem.
by their own admission or, those higher up than them let go of that problem. So they're not looking for someone to step in and be another problem, but to be a part of the solution. Great stuff.
Yep, exactly. And it goes beyond just, hey, you're looking for a job, but it just goes to, it can be applied to any situation that you're in, just going above and beyond, and really, no matter what, group you're in, even if it's your work or even if it's not related to work, just not being a part of the problem, but being part of to whatever solution that may be presented. If there's a problem that's presented, be part of the solution. Don't be part of the problem.
Yes. Yes. There's a difference between people who do versus people who don't, which is where we get into this next section on act or be acted upon. But he says here, consider people who exercise initiative as the day, picture of the day, and those who don't exercise initiative as the night. And then he says there is a 5,000% difference between these two types of people. And this is where he touches back to the P/PC balance, which is why it's so important. Of course, you read these chapters in order, because he says that to create the P/ the production /production capability balance of your effectiveness in your life, you develop those habits, and that's where you get the do versus the don'ts.
Right.
Yeah.
It all takes initiative, and initiative is huge. It's huge in this equation, and it's huge in in everything in life. This whole book requires initiative. You know what I mean, and really, doing and accomplishing things that are meaningful takes initiative.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And that's kind of like, that's what I thought about. That's like the American dream, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The American dream is basically to take initiative and to choose your own life, choose your own path.
It's always been about doing.
Yeah. It's always been about doing.
Not about sitting back and letting other people do it before you do it.
Yeah.
But actually doing it. And I think if I read it correctly, he kind of makes up that number, that 5,000% difference, just as an exaggeration,
But that's how huge it is for him. In his mind, that's how huge the difference between someone with initiative and someone without.
Right.
Is 5,000%.
And he pulls it out. He pulls it out in the stories that he tells throughout this with the businesses and the very personal stories like, Frank L.
Yeah.
So he illustrates that.
Yep, and he goes on, and I mentioned this, I think, the last segment of this, but when he talks about he was working with the company, and he was telling them, or they were working, and they were, hey, let's be real about our situation here, and he's talking about the difference between positive thinking and proactivity, because there's a difference, and the clear difference is they faced reality, right? Proactive people face reality. They're real about the negatives. But we faced it, he says, with the current circumstance and of future projections. But we also face the reality that we had the power to choose positive responses over negative ones and over circumstances and projections. Not facing reality would have been to accept the idea that what's happening in our environment had to determine us. And so again, that's being reactive. He's like, we're not based on, things might look negative, but we're not going to choose to react negatively to that. We're going to be proactive and respond in a positive way.
Yes.
So that's the difference between positive thinking and proactivity, which is important.
Yes. And what lends towards our proactiveness is found in the details, which is why he covers this language, which you already read, those reactive languages versus the proactive. There's one quote in here a couple pages after this section begins that I just want to read, and you may want to go back. But he says, a serious problem with reactive language is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. He says people become reinforced in the paradigm that they are determined and that they produce evidence to support their belief. They feel increasingly victimized and out of control, not in charge of their life or their destiny, which being proactive gives us, that sense of control and charge, even while recognizing that there are things that are and will always be outside of our control.
Yep.
But just
now that we're transitioning back to the language aspect of it, I feel like I keep saying this part is huge to the puzzle, or this piece is huge to the puzzle. It's all important, right? Is what it comes down to. Like you said earlier, we could underline anything here and it would be worth underlining probably. Each of these topics that he covers under proactivity, they're all important pieces to the puzzle, And another I highlighted that quote as well.
Which we don't sit down and highlight and look together at this book.
No.
A lot of this study that we do is independent, and then we
Yep.
come here, and then we do find that everything we highlight and underline, the other person has also. It just depends on
Probably.
who gets to it first.
Yeah.
and their
Who
excitement.
mentions it first?
Right.
Yeah, and again, the important part of the language, he says, comes from a basic paradigm of determinism, and the whole spirit of it is to transfer the responsibility, the language of transferring the responsibility from I am not responsible to I am choosing my response, and I am responsible.
Yeah.
So that's when he talks about all those language examples of reactive language versus proactive language. It's basically all of it is the transitioning from I'm not responsible to I'm responsible.
Yes.
And that's what, basically this whole language section is talking about, is just choose language that puts the responsibility back on you, because that's where it belongs.
Yeah, that's where it belongs. Yeah, exactly.
So anything else in the language section, or do you want to move on to circle of concern, circle of influence?
No, we can. Yeah, let's go to the circle of influence and circle of concern.
All right.
We mentioned earlier that we would pull up that graphic for you, which I have here. And interesting, you have it in your physical book as well, so he draws it in both places. But of course, the circle of influence is the things that you have control over and can take direct action on. In the circle of concern, he gives examples: your health, children's society, the national debt, war, things that oftentimes we're concerned with but are outside of our control. And he even mentions that reactive people focus their efforts in the circle of concern, which is really just a waste of effort when we step back and look at this big picture. Really just a waste of our concern. If you're like me, this may not be the most proactive choice, but I look at that and I think to myself, I have wasted so much time, which may be the proactive choice, because you recognize the truth of it, that you have wasted so much time in the circle of concern.
And that's what he says, right? He says he mentioned that here. He said really thinking about and determining which of these two circles is your focus, which of these circles you focus on more of. It's very you can discover much about the degree of your proactivity. So it's very self-revealing, to your own personal life. And obviously, we're not all 100% focused on our level of concern, and we're not all 100% focused on our level of influence, our circle of influence. But we can also see, reading this and thinking about it, we can see times where we've been too involved in the circle of concern and not involved enough in our circle of influence.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Which I don't know if you have any other quotes that you wanted to read from that section, but it lends itself, these two circles lends itself so congruently to this next section, where he gets into even more specifics. Really, if you picture this as a circle, it'd go from 2 circles to even 3, where we get direct, indirect, and no control. And that the problems that we face fall in one of these areas. And he mentions that direct control problems are served by working on our habits, and that these are private victories. So there's that victory language: private victories, habits 1, 2, and 3 are those private victories, and then public victories, which are 4, 5, and 6. So others will recognize the habits 4, 5, and 6. People are not going to be able to vocalize, you're really proactive. Now, if you've read this book and you start, talking this out with your friend, and, this is something that you work on, then you could say, hey, great proactive choice, and encourage them that way. But other people are not going to see those private victories, which
they might see the consequences of them, though, as he talks about.
Yes.
Because whether it's a positive proactive response or a negative reactive response, there are consequences to each of them.
Right.
So the people will see they might not see the active, oh, hey, he's being proactive or whatever, but they will see the consequences of it. That's no matter which way it is.
That's right.
But the direct, indirect, and no control, which again just kind of highlights that there are things that happen or things that go on in life that we don't have any control over. There are things that happen in our life that we have some influence on, and then there are things that we have direct influence on. And all those are important to understand so that you can base your response to things accordingly.
Yes.
And expanding the circle of influence, this next section here, I think this is a really, this one's struck me because this is where he talks about he talks about the story with the boss, right? The boss who was hard to deal with, and the one guy who was being proactive and helping his boss out, and he was thinking of his needs, and he was doing everything. He was going above and beyond to help his boss, and the boss then turns to him and asks him for his opinion when he never asked anyone else for his opinion. Right. He never asked any of his employees for their opinion. And he says this line right after that. He says his circle of influence had grown. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the cool thing about this, is that he says it is inspiring to realize that in choosing our response to circumstance, we powerfully affect our circumstance. Basically saying we can grow our circle of influence. Mm-hmm. So it's not even, our circle of influence is not even limited, which is cool. And
your circle of influence is not determined by if you really are the boss or not at your job. I mean, you could be, one of the lower positions in the office when it comes to the amount of responsibility or decisions that you make, but still have a big part in this circle of influence, which is great.
Yep. And I think that's, it seems like almost limiting. Oh, my circle, only working in my circle of influence, only, working on that, being proactive in that, but actually working on your circle of influence, you actually can expand it. And then you have more influence. And that's not like influence, so you can get people to do what you want. That's not obviously what he means by influence, but it becomes that, through your being proactive, you just positively affect other people even more so. It's an exponential kind of growth pattern.
And there is a difference between being known, being famous, and being an influencer. Right. An influencer is something I think more people are chasing now that we're in 2020, because that word is thrown out a lot more.
Social media influencer.
For instance. And the difference between being famous and being an influencer is famous people are known. Influencers, however, actually change the status quo or change the actions, behaviors, beliefs, or thoughts about other people. Yes. And that's the difference.
It's basically being a leader.
It's it is being a leader. Mm-hmm. And I love how in one of these pages here in this section on explaining the circle of influence, he gets really practical with what it means to be proactive.
Yeah.
Because he talks about this executive that was proactive. Yeah. And he says he was driven by his values, not his feelings. So that's one element of being proactive. He took initiative, which we've talked about. And he broke that down even further. He said that he anticipated, he empathized, and he read the situation. Yeah. He wasn't blind to weaknesses, but instead of criticizing them, he would compensate for them. And I know we talked about that pretty hard, but that just breaks down just more of the specific actions of what it looks to be proactive.
Yep. And the last thing on that, I actually kind of jotted this in the outline in the side. Basically, again, referring back to one of the previous chapters, he basically went from he made it to the interdependence level. You know what I mean? It's basically what happened with this guy and his boss, is that they're now interdependent with each other, and that they co-work together, and it's not just him telling him what to do, but they're actually working together as a team. And that's what he says. He says as a team.
Yes.
They're working together.
Right. And you would think to yourself, okay, well, the leader, the boss should be doing that. That's what they should be. And I find myself saying that a lot too. This person should be doing this and this person should be doing that. But I'm not in control of what they should be doing. Yep. I'm in control of what I can do. And so that's
transitions into this next section. Woo! It really does. The haves and the bees. Yeah. And again, it's really, kind of almost an extension of that language section, which, if only I had a boss, like for an example, I had a boss that was proactive with me, or I had a boss that wanted to work as a team. You know what I mean? It's those things that if I only had this, if I only had that. And that's definitely for me, that's one of the traps that's easy to fall into, is like, man, if I only had this, if I only had that, and sometimes I do stop, not all the time, but sometimes I do stop myself, and I'm like, I should not worry so much about what I don't have. Right. You know what I mean? Right. And I should focus on, okay, it may be nice, but like, what can I do about it? Yeah. What can I do that will actually be a benefit, instead of just being like, man, I wish I had that, or wish I had this.
Yes.
What can I do about it? Yeah. That's what I try to remember to ask myself. Don't always do it, but I try.
Well, that's the proactive thought, though.
Yeah.
Because in reality, yes, we could always use more resources, and we think if I had more, then I could be more of an influencer. But really, we already have everything that we need because it starts with ourselves. We have everything that we need to start that circle of influence and broaden it.
Yeah,
for sure.
And this might be my quote of the book, or of this chapter. The quote of the chapter here for me is: anytime we think the problem is out there, that thought is the problem. and man, again, like, how many times do we think the problem is out there? But it's actually, that thought is the problem. Like, there's no other way to say it. That thought is the problem.
Right. Yes.
And that's just kind of a hilarious, again, a paradigm shift, because I don't think many of us think about that being a problem, but it is.
It is.
Yeah. And
pretty much throughout this whole chapter, he looks at us in the face and says,
it's tough.
This is a problem, yes, but really you're the problem.
You're the problem
to the problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very, yeah.
And like we said, it's if you come at this with an open mind, some of this stings a little bit. It does, because it's a challenge. It's challenging for sure. But working on this and being proactive actually leads to, it'll be really beneficial if we nail this down. And but yeah, the problem is out there. Is the problem. That's the problem. And
one of my favorite, unless you have more in that section, one of my favorite sections is the other end of the stick, which is, I believe, right after this one.
Yeah.
Where this is probably, if I had to choose a favorite, this is probably mine, because I instantly, when you mentioned favorite, I was like, oh, this is where mine is, and I flipped to it. And he says, while we are free to choose our actions, we are not free to choose the consequences of those actions.
Yeah.
But then he goes to say on another page that the proactive approach to a mistake is to acknowledge it instantly, correct, and learn from it.
Right.
To do that, and what stands out to me there is to do that instantly, to acknowledge it, to correct it, and to learn from it.
Right. Again, another thing that's not easy to do.
Right.
Simple, but not easy.
Right. Because in reality, those, let me just turn back to it so I can read it here. He says that the consequences of many of our actions are governed by natural law, and what he means by that is a lot of them are in that circle of concern.
Yeah.
So we can't control that anyway, but we can control the action before the consequence, which is why he mentions to take it and to learn from it.
And then if you make a mistake, you'd be like, hey, this is what happened. I made a mistake. And then basically he's saying, because what's in the past, what we've already done, is in our circle of concern, and it's not in our circle of influence. Yeah. Just, hey, I made a mistake, and then you can move past it and leave it in the circle of concern where it belongs. Right. Is basically what he's saying, and which is, again, another amazing thought, and a key principle.
Yes.
And I do want to mention one more thing over here, where I mentioned this story a little bit, where he's talking about the nagging husband, and I just wanted to read the quote directly from him because this stuck with me. He basically talking about having the nagging husband, about the things that the wife isn't doing right or wish she would do better, that type of thing. He's saying, if I have a problem in my marriage, what do I really gain by continually confessing my wife's sins? By saying I'm not responsible, I take myself a powerless victim. I immobilize myself in a negative situation. I also diminish, here's the part that really struck me. I also diminish my ability to influence her. My nagging, accusing, and critical attitude only makes her feel validated in her own weakness. My criticism is worse than the conduct I want to correct. My ability to positively impact the situation withers and dies. Basically saying that your criticism of that is actually just worse than what was going on in the first place. And again, it's that thought of what we say and what we say to other people, that it matters, and it has a huge impact. It can have a huge impact.
Yes.
And that actually, him nagging or whatever, it actually doesn't make the situation any better. It makes it worse.
Right.
Which, is, again, a lot of language in this. Being proactive, it definitely, it's part of it is our thoughts and our way we approach problems and situations, but a lot of it comes out through the language that we use.
Yeah. And that's why he stacks, because there is so much wording to it. And I think there are even a couple more illustrations we could cover, but that's why I think he stacks illustration upon illustration upon illustration to submit this into our minds. Making and keeping commitments section. He says here, one of the very first things he says is at the very heart of our circle of influence is our ability to make and keep commitments and promises, which is not something I have always been good at doing.
Yeah.
But that's at the very heart of our circle of influence, because if we think about it, if we're constantly letting people down, not keeping our promises and different things like that, then our influence is going to diminish severely.
And making commitments to other people and following through on that starts with just making commitments to yourself. It's a little bit of self-discipline, kind of mixed in there. Like you just got to be able to say it, and if you're going to do something, say it and then follow through.
Yes. Right. And earlier I mentioned honor, which he mentions in this section by saying, by making and keeping promises to ourselves and others, little by little, our honor, and could even supplement that word discipline you just mentioned, becomes greater than our moods.
Yeah.
So.
Whew.
Yeah.
I got, last quote.
Go ahead, man.
Last quote here, and then this is in the last section. He ends the chapter. Actually, this is the final words in the chapter. Knowing that we are responsible, right, is fundamental to effectiveness and to every other habit of effectiveness that we will discuss. And that pretty much sums it up right there.
That does. Yes, that's right after the 30-day challenge, which if you're reading this, I plan on taking that 30-day test and seeing how I do, taking time to reflect and to look back at these proactive situations and see how
really
well I do.
The hard part of the difficult part of that is just remembering to actually pay attention to that. The real challenge is remembering to pay attention to that.
That's right. Yes.
So we'll try. Maybe we'll try and keep each other accountable on that. Maybe one day I'll be like, Chris, I'll text him. Chris, are you being proactive today?
I hope I can respond with "I am."
Yeah, you can text me that too.
I'll text you that too
randomly throughout the week or
the
next
honest.
couple of weeks. Yeah. So, man, that's a lot. That's a lot.
It is a dense.
It's a thick chapter.
It is a thick chapter.
It's all good though.
It is great. As we said, we could underline every word of it. But I'm glad that you ended with that. And
it boils down to it's all your I say that jokingly, but there's a little bit of truth to that. It boils down to, you're in charge, basically.
You are.
And you have more control than maybe even you think.
Right.
And we have total control of our actions and what we choose to do and how we choose to respond.
Right.
To anything.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah. So now the key is to work on that.
That's right.
To not just remember it like we talked about, but applying it.
Yes.
Like we said in the very first chapter, and like Stephen Covey said in the very first chapter, know it, remember it, apply it.
Yeah. And keep the desire going to keep doing it. And the great thing about this is, next week for our next podcast episode, we'll be moving into habit 2, which is begin with the end in mind. So I'm curious to learn what he means by that. But it all starts with being proactive.
Yep. There we go. Habit 2 next week.
I'll see you then.
Yep. See you then.